Hi everybody, this is Rhys Barber from Audiology Associates. Thank you very much for watching our aural info bite video today. We're going to be talking today about the 3 different types of hearing loss. But before we get into that, I need to give you the answer to last week's question. So in last week's video, we asked the question, where in the cochlea is low frequency sound picked up? And the answer to that was C, which was the apex, the very top of the cochlea. Now, the first 3 people to get that right on YouTube were Candice Curtis, Joe P, and Stephen. So well done, guys. And the first 3 people to get that right on Facebook were Kyla Black, Katrina Faltzminer, and Linda Wolf. So well done to you guys as well. Gold star from Mr. B. There will be another question at the end of this video, guys. So if you want to be in the chance for a shout out next week, stay tuned for the end, okay? So we're going to be talking today about the 3 different types of hearing loss. Well, there's actually 2, and the third one's kind of a mixture of the first 2. So let's start talking about these then. So the first type of hearing loss we're going to talk about is going to be a conductive hearing loss, okay? Now, conductive hearing loss refers to any problem where you have an issue getting the sound to the inner part of the ear. So I want to imagine the inner part of the ear is working well, but we have a problem with the sound getting to the inner part of the ear. So this tends to affect the middle ear and the outer ear. So if we talk about a really simple problem, such as earwax, if your ear canal is completely blocked with earwax, that's classed as a conductive hearing loss because it's stopping the sound from getting to the inner part of the ear. And if we talk about the middle ear space, we could be talking about an issue with fluid in the middle ear space, restricting the movement to the eardrum, or we could be talking about a problem with the 3 little bones, the ossicles, such as where they can dislocate or they can become fused together. Both of those issues are going to cause a problem as far as getting the sound to the inner part of the ear. Most conductive hearing losses require some form of medical intervention. So for example, with earwax, you've seen us in our videos remove earwax for people. So we can do that. If it's a problem with the middle ear space, you're looking more usually at a more sort of surgical intervention. So it would be with an ear, nose and throat consultant just to try and correct that problem. But the good thing is if you can correct that problem successfully, that hearing is going to come back quite a way. Now, the second type of hearing loss we're going to be talking about is something called a sensory neural hearing loss. Now, when we look at the word sensory neural, we've got 2 parts to it. We've got sensory and we've got neural. So sensory talks about any problem with the cochlea. Neural talks about any problem past the cochlea, so the nerve that leads from behind the cochlea up to the brain. So let's talk about sensory issues first of all. What kind of problem can we get if we've got a sensory neural hearing loss? Well, the most common type of problem is age-related hearing loss, and probably the second most common is noise-induced hearing loss. Now, both of these have a very similar basis to them, okay? So your first one, if we talk about age-related hearing loss, remember from last week's video, we talked about how sound is passed through the cochlea. So when the sound comes in, it causes a vibration in that and a wave in that fluid, and then that causes your hair cells to move. Well, if you remember from that video, the very front part of the cochlea is where high-frequency sound is picked up. So I want you to imagine every sound that comes in passes over that group of hair cells. And what happens every time a sound goes in, after a while it starts to cause a bit of damage to those little hair cells on the top, and they start to degrade, and eventually it will result in the hair cell dying off. Now, because that high frequency part of hearing is found right at the entrance, it means that when you have an age-related hearing loss or a noise-induced hearing loss, that's the part of your hearing that gets affected first. So we start to lose some of our high frequency hearing. Now, what does that mean in relation to what we hear day to day? Well, the most common presentation for patients coming through with this type of problem is they hear very similarly in both sides. It's been a very slow progressive hearing loss over time. And they will normally say the same thing, which is everything is loud enough, but it's just not clear enough. So you start to miss some of the clarity, and that's what high frequency hearing gives you, is clarity. So when we talk about age-related hearing loss, we're talking about a very slow progression, these hair cells getting degraded down and then starting to eventually die off. When we talk about noise-induced hearing loss, that process is the same one, but it's happening much, much faster. So I want you to imagine that these hair cells are being affected and degraded much, much quicker. Now, this could be from, say, a sudden impact sound. When we talk about an impact sound, we mean a loud, sudden sound, firework going off, that kind of thing. Or we could be talking about working in a very noisy environment where there's always this steady state, chronic amount of noise in the background. And what you get then is it degrades those hair cells much, much quicker for those higher frequency bands. So they would present with very similar hearing test results. So how do you fix this kind of problem? Well, if it's a sensory neural problem, the majority of cases will be using a hearing aid to boost that up, to boost those sounds up, to make it easier for that person to hear and provide them with some clarity again, okay? Now, when we talk about a neural hearing loss, we're talking about any problem that affects the nerve, basically, from the cochlea up to the brain. I wouldn't say this is a very most common problem, but it's probably the thing you see most often affecting that particular part would be something called an acoustic neuroma, which is where you get a little tumor that grows around that nerve, they're not very common, and they can, in most cases, be treated with a bit of surgery. But yeah, so that would be kind of more of a neural problem. So we talked about conductive, we've talked about sensory neural. So what's this third hearing loss? Well, basically, it's a mixture of those two things happening at the same time. So if you had, say, an age-related hearing loss, which is affecting the inner part of the ear, and then you had, say, wax on the outer part of the ear, that would be classed as a mixed hearing loss. So how do we tell what type of hearing loss a person has? Well, as an audiologist, one of the first things we would do on somebody is take a look in their ears. So when you take a look in somebody's ear, you can normally spot any problems with the outer ear and any problems with the eardrum itself. But to establish whether a problem lies further in the ear, then what we do is something called an audiogram. So we carry out a hearing test and do something called pure tone audiometry. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cover this in next week's video, but just to give you a general overview, we're going to test the whole hearing pathway, and then that will help us identify where the problem lies within that chain. Okay, so guys, to recap, there are three different types of hearing loss. You have a conductive hearing loss, which can affect the outer and middle ear, and that's any problem with the sound getting to the inner part of the ear is classed as conductive. You have a sensory neural hearing loss, which is affecting the cochlea or the nerve leading from the cochlea to the brain. These tend to be more permanent hearing losses, which would normally require hearing aids to try and fix those issues. And the third is a mixed hearing loss, which is a combination of conductive and sensory neural hearing losses together. Okay, so your question for today's video is, I'm going to give you an example of a type of hearing loss, and I want you to tell me whether it's A, conductive, B, sensory neural, or C, mixed. So if somebody had a perforated eardrum, would that be A, a conductive hearing loss, B, a sensory neural hearing loss, or C, a mixed hearing loss? Post your answer to that question into the comment section below. We're going to do it differently this week. I'm going to pick 3 people at random who will give us a correct answer from Facebook and 3 at random from YouTube. And we're going to give you a shout out and post those answers into next week's video as well. So as always, guys, take care of yourselves and one another. We'll see you for next week's video, which is going to be talking about hearing testing and pure tone audiometry. So as always, guys, have a good couple of days and we shall see you next week. Take care.